You're watching The Ready Writer, a show where I get to speak to writers of all different genres, mediums, and experiences. The Ready Writer. Are you ready? In this interview, Corey Poirier was in an airport, so if you hear a little bit of background noise, that's what it is. I hope you enjoyed this interview. Welcome to another episode of The Ready Writer. I am your host, Casey Bell, and today's guest is Corey Poirier. Corey Poirier is an entrepreneur, motivational speaker, TEDx talk speaker, and author of The Enlightened Passenger. He discussed his book and his journey to writing his book. The first question I asked him was, how did he become an entrepreneur and speaker?
I was raised by a single mother, grew up in a small town, graduated without knowing the difference between fiction and nonfiction, which is kind of ironic now being a writer. Also didn't read my first book until age 27. And so that was kind of my background. So I certainly wasn't picked as being likely to succeed. But that's how I started. But my grandfather was also a carpenter. And he worked for other people for years, but then eventually went into business for himself. And by the time I was growing up, he was running his own business as a carpenter. So that was my really only family member that I saw as an entrepreneur. But I liked everything I saw about it because I got to see him working for other people. He kind of got to set his own hours. You know, if there were days that something was going on at home and every now and then I would work with him, I would see that he could stay home an extra hour if something was going on, whereas all the other people I knew had to go right to work. And so I think he was maybe the one person that kind of in my head led me down this crazy path of entrepreneurship. So, you know, again, raised by a single mother, my grandfather became my surrogate father and was the only entrepreneur I knew. And that's, I think, what started my journey. And then, you know, me graduating and barely graduating from high school, I think also started my journey as well.
Corey's journey filled him with great wisdom and insight. He shares who his mentors were and how he obtained such wisdom.
Well, when I first started, my grandfather was kind of that mentor for me. He taught me about kind of life lessons like the importance of working smart as well as hard, things like that. But what really kind of seeded it for me is my obsession became around interviewing other people, like thought leaders, high achievers. And I get to start learning from them, basically what they were doing. So I noticed that most of them were meditating. So then I started to explore that. I noticed a lot of them were doing yoga. So I started exploring that. And so what happened was by interviewing these thought leaders, I got to learn about what they did that was different than everybody else. And then I would get to practice it and test it on myself. And so, for instance, you mentioned doubling a person's money, for instance. Well, one of the things I did, and of course, first of all, I'm not a financial expert. And secondly, I'm not a lawyer. So I can't tell you that this is truly what it took for me. But what I can tell you is that I actually, a couple of years ago, met a guy named Ken Honda, who wrote a book called Happy Money. And in that book, he talks about the importance of being grateful for your abundance of money. And so he says arigato every time money comes in, and also arigato every time he sends money out. So I decided to start testing this about 2 years ago. And since that time, I doubled my income or revenue the first year I did it. And then I doubled it again from the higher number from the previous year. So basically, I guess you could say I almost tripled my revenue by simply starting to say arigato every day and really meaning it. So for example, whenever I make a payment now, if I buy something, I literally say arigato as I send it out into the world. Like with all my being, I thank the universe for allowing me to have money to buy this thing, whatever it is. And again, I can't sit here. There's no way to test that and say that's why my revenue went higher. But what I do know is I didn't change much else, and yet my revenue went higher. So it's like a placebo thing. Even if it wasn't real, it worked for me, and I'll keep doing it. So again, that's one of the things. But really the deeper thing, Casey, is I learned that from interviewing other people. So really when you say, you know, did I have mentors? How did this all come about? It's solely because I started interviewing, at this point, thousands of people that have achieved stuff that most other people haven't, asked them how they achieved it, and then practiced what I learned. And I will say that played a really big part in both the successes I've had and also, you know, the book that you can see on the screen that I just wrote. It's a fictional book, but it's loosely based on what I learned during these 7,000 plus interviews now with thought leaders. So really, that's how that knowledge came to be.
Corey has interviewed thousands of people worldwide. Corey discusses how he started his journalism career.
That when I was 19, I launched this business publication, a newspaper. And for that publication, to fill the content, I had to interview people. Now, this is way back when I was 19. This is going back to the mid 90s. And I did that for a year, and I was obsessed with interviewing, but I was also running a business from scratch without having any knowledge in doing so. So everything was like straight commission. I was in sales. So if I didn't sell ads, I didn't pay for the paper. And after a year, it became apparent that it really wasn't going to be a lucrative thing. And I ultimately made the decision to pull the plug. So that's how I got started in interviewing people. Then I went on my way, went down the corporate path, worked for a Fortune 500, Global 1000 company, found my way into speaking. And as I got into speaking heavily, I realized that I had extra time because as a speaker, you're constantly looking for your next booking. But at the same time, when you're doing bookings, you really you travel, and on the way to travel, you're not doing anything on the trip. I mean, you might be working, but then you go do a talk for 45 minutes, then you travel back. So I had a lot of extra time or excess time. And I was at one point finally paying the bills with speaking. So I realized I could take on a side hustle. So I relaunched a similar version of that newspaper I had. And to do that, again, I had to fill it with interviews. So I went back to my early obsession, started interviewing people. And then how I got into interviewing celebrities or big name thought leaders was I leveraged that newspaper early on because at the time, most things were going online and we had a print paper that was reaching thousands of people. So I could leverage it because the people I was interviewing liked the idea that they were still going to be in a print publication, and the bigger names, I could put them on the front cover. So being able to say, hey, we're going to put you on the front cover of a publication that reaches thousands of people was very attractive. So that allowed me to get interviews with people like Jack Canfield, the Chicken Soup for the Soul co-creator, eventually Mark Victor Hansen, which was the other co-creator. I'm trying to think of an example, a guy named Dr. David Suzuki, who was an environmentalist, but a really big name thought leader in Canada. And so all these people, I was able to leverage this publication at first. And then I morphed the publication into an online radio show. And because I was able to name drop some of the people I interviewed, because of that, then what that allowed me to do was leverage those names to get the next big one. And so it became, like I say, a domino effect. If you can push the first big hard domino down, it knocks the next one down, and it knocks the next one down. So that's what I did. I realized, for example, I'll give you a hack or a secret for people that want to interview big name thought leaders. I would go to their website and I would see who endorsed them. And then I would reach out to the person that endorsed them. Because usually if you're endorsing somebody, your name's not as big, but it means you know them really well. So I went and I did that, and I was able to get people that maybe weren't being approached as much for interviews, and they would say yes. And then I would bring up the person that I was trying to reach, and they would start talking to them about them, and they would say, yeah, you should get them on the show. They'd love this. And then I would take that clip and send it to their team, the big name thought leader, and say, look, even your coach thinks you should be on my show. And that's kind of how I started. And another thing I did was I would go onto Amazon and look at their coming soon books, and I would go back like 6 months, and I would see who has a book coming out in 6 months, because that's usually when they're willing to do interviews. So I would just reach out to them 6 months early versus the people that were reaching out to them a month before. And I would get more interviews that way because they weren't full yet of all the interviews they had to do. So those are some quick hacks of how I did it. But how it started was for this business that I built, and I needed to do the interviews to create the content for the publication.
Corey used his interviews to write his fictional book, The Enlightened Passenger. He talks about the synopsis of the book and how he combined his interviews into this amazing book.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And the synopsis, in a nutshell, is basically two passengers on a plane. One is a older, wiser man. One is a younger, say, business person who thinks they know it all at this point. And the thinks that knows it all person books their seat in first class and then also pays for the seat next to them, so they won't have anybody sitting next to them. They fall asleep and they wake up to an older, wiser man sitting next to them. Ask how he got there. He said he was bumped from economy. And so he said now he was a seatmate. Well, the young guy wants to go to sleep and ignore him until he hears that the older man has made some money. Then he wants to know how the old man made this money so he can make it too. So he finally listens to the old man. And then the flight turns into the two of them chatting, with the old man teaching life lessons from his journey in life to the younger guy, basically 10 life lessons. And essentially the younger guy becomes the reluctant protege who learns these life lessons, and the flight changes his life. So that's kind of the story. And what it took me a while to learn, Casey, is that I'm really both passengers. I didn't realize this even after the book was written. But ultimately, I was that young business person early on in sales, thought I knew it all. I wasn't arrogant like the young guy, but I thought I knew it all. And then hopefully now I'm closer to that older, wiser guy named Treb, who who's just traveled his journey and now wants to share what he's learned. And so that's how it becomes a fictional, is I think it's just me basically fictionalizing my life and turning it into multiple characters. The idea of, in terms of the book, and kind of, I guess, how I weave the life lessons in and what I learned in those interviews, is it's literally me sharing what I've learned during the interviews through the eyes of the wise passenger. And so far, so much that I actually take parts from my life and turn it into a fictionalized version in the book. So for instance, in the book, the character Trev says he was sitting backstage with the legendary speaker Les Brown. He asked Les Brown about synchronicity, and Les said he thinks it's God's way of staying anonymous. Well, that quote by Les was delivered to me in Les's living room. So it's still Les shared the quote. I'm still sharing the quote that Les shared, but I'm sharing it through the lens of the character. So that's kind of how I weave in it being a fictional book, but it's really a fictionalized version of my life in a lot of ways.
Corey discusses his journey of publishing his latest book.
So as far as, it wasn't my first book, so I knew the publishing side actually quite well. In fact, I've done 7 books that I've published with my name on it that were solely me putting the book out. I say it that way because 2 of them were written fully by me. The other ones were actually interviews that I did, were turned into conversations in the book. But those are still my books. And then on top of that, I've released now 14 or 13 of our Blue Talks books, which is an anthology book that we publish. And then I've been a part of maybe 10 co-author books where I wrote a chapter, let's say. So I wasn't anywhere near new to publishing, but at the same time, I was new to writing a book like this. So like a fictionalized account of a real story. That's something I hadn't written before. And I would compare it to books like The Alchemist or The Celestine Prophecy or The Richest Man in Babylon, for people have heard of any of those. The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari by Robin Sharma. And so it's like those books. So I wasn't used to writing a book like that. So that part was all new. Having said that, all I did really was I sat down with the idea and knew kind of what I wanted the story to be about. And then the characters truly just came to life in front of my eyes. So it was the first time doing it, but I won't tell you it was a hard labor to do it because of the fact that it seemed to come to life as soon as I sat down to write it. And then the publishing side, I already had that experience. Having said that, this book is with a traditional New York publisher, though. It's with Morgan James Publishing. So they're handling the publishing. It's only the second time I've done that out of like 28 books. But the big part of that is because I know the publishing side, it helps me understand what they're going to do to help and what I'm supposed to do to help and how the marketing works and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of, like I said, I'd be lying to say I don't understand the process, but as far as writing a book like this, it was all learn as you go, basically.
When asked what was the easiest part about publishing the book and the most challenging, Corey shared the following.
This is a cop-out answer, meaning it's not a sexy answer. The challenging part was waiting for the book to be done, meaning like published. Not done, like to be where I could hold a copy of the book in my hand. That was the hard part because I'm not a patient guy. And, going with a publisher, it's going to take longer. Now, the positive side of that, and then I'll give you more, ones that aren't just quick, easy answers. But the best part about that is I went with a publisher who is a New York publisher, but they're set up in such a way that they're a mix between both. Like I get to retain more copyright of my book. I get more say in it. There's a lot of stuff like that. The other side, though, that was good about it is because they've worked with me before, because I had a very sound business plan and they knew how big I want to take this book, they fast-tracked it unlike anything I've seen a publisher ever do. Meaning, I think from the minute they had the book in their hands till the minute I held a copy in my hands was about 4.5 months. Normally, with a traditional publisher, you're looking at 2 years before you can even think about that. My last book with the same publisher was almost 2 years. So that was unheard of. But I think they see what we're doing with the book and say, you know what? Like, here's the thing. Publishers don't fast track usually, but you know yourself, if a big story breaks, they can put a book out in a week. So they can do it. So I knew they could do it. And I knew that they realized how much I was putting into this book that they didn't have to put into it to make it a success. So the good and bad is I don't have a lot of patience. So even 4 months was long. The good was it was only 4 months. As far as the hardest part in terms of everything related to the book in general, I would say the hardest part is always in a launch, bringing everybody together and keeping them excited enough to keep talking about it for months and months and months, whenever really at the end of the day, they didn't write it. So it's not like, it's not their baby. And I would say, the best part for me of this was actually seeing it come to life, because I honestly believe it's exactly as the book was supposed to be, and knowing that it hasn't been changed from what my original intent was. I mean, that was probably the best part of it. And, even if I say easiest part, the easiest part was writing it, really, because it came to life in front of my eyes.
If you are an aspiring author and looking for encouragement and advice on writing and publishing your very first book, Corey had the following to share with you.
There's a couple of things there. I would give again another answer. I'll call it cop-out answer, and the reason I call it that is because people are going to say, "That's it." I need something more than that. But the first part I would say, Casey, is write a good book. I think that's right now one of the biggest challenges we're seeing is people are now leaning on AI to write the book. And so now that book it's basically a book grabbed from other people's stuff on the internet. I mean, and then you're cramming it together like taking 8 homes and putting them together. It's not going to be pretty. And so I think at a time like that, the first advice I would give is write a friggin' good book. Even if it takes you 4 years, write a good book. If I look at the books I referenced earlier, like The Alchemist, sold 300 million copies. Celestine Prophecy sold 80 million, maybe 100 million have read it with all the used copies. If I go to The Richest Man of Babylon, and I could Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, 100 million copies. When I start listing these iconic books, the one thing they have in common, if you can only pick one thing they all have in common, it's they're friggin' good books. So write a good book is my first word of advice. But again, I always worry about that person listening saying, well, that's a given, because maybe they're already planning to write or they've already written a good book. So I always like to give more tips than just the one, which I think is probably most important. So the second thing I would say is realize that you're going to have to market this book. A lot of people, I should say, write a book and then think if it's brilliant, it'll sell itself. And I'm here to tell you it doesn't. It really doesn't. I mentioned the Celestine has sold 40 million copies. Well, I'm good friends with the author. Him and his wife, for years, drove around to 2,000 bookstores, handing out the book free, talking about the book to get it moving. It didn't happen by itself, and that's a book that sold 40 million copies, and obviously is a brilliant book. The Alchemist was self-published at first, too, and he had to work because nobody wanted the book. That's a good book. What I mean is just writing a good book isn't enough. So what I would say is the hardest part to sell books is to rely on one person bought the book and they're going to tell other people. Now, obviously, if you can create a book that's a pass-along book, then that stuff takes care of itself. What I would say you need to do is build relationships with people that can reach a lot of people for you. So put in the time, put in the effort, put in the work now to give first, build relationships with people, and then those people can maybe send it out to 100,000 people versus you trying to go one by one by one. So what I'm really saying here is build collaboration/affiliate relationships before you need them. So I would say start doing that now, which also includes building an email list. Because if you have an email list, those affiliates are going to take you more seriously because they'll know you can share for them later as well. So those are some things I would say. And then on the book side, to help it become a pass-along book, what I'm doing with this book, and I know Celestine did, is at the back of the book, talk about how like, for example, in my case, I'm teaching another character. So I tell the character at the end, you need to write this stuff in a book and share it with the world and make sure to pass it along to everybody. But what I'm really doing is telling the reader to pass this book along to the world, because now there is a book they can hold to do that. On the front end, a hack that I wish I would have known when I started is put something in the beginning of the book that says, thank you for grabbing the book. And as a thank you, I want to give you this for free. Go to the site and grab this. So the first 3 or 4 pages, basically put a landing page that says, go grab my free 10 tips. And this is fictional and non-fictional. Go grab my free 10 tips for this at this website. Because then what happens is now, all of a sudden, when people buy the book, before they've even read it, because some people might not get all the way through, they're signing up for your email list. And now you have a way to market to them in the future. That could even be a way to market to them and say, hey, have you read the book yet? It could even just be the market to them to the push. So I would put an opt-in page at the beginning of the book if your publisher will let you. And the other benefit of doing it in the first few pages is on Amazon, people can view the first 10 pages. So they might not even buy your book, but in the first 3 pages, it might say, hey, get the free audio version here. And they might opt in, and now you can market to them in the future. Versus if you don't do that, they go buy it on Amazon. You'll never even know they bought the book unless they tell you. So those are like maybe, in a few minutes. Those are like 3 or 4 hacks that I wish I would have known when I started.
Lastly, Corey shares the one interview that has not happened yet that he is continuing to make sure happens.
I've said this many times, hoping that eventually they'll hear it and reach out to me and say, I'm in, finally, is Seth Godin. So I don't know if you know who Seth Godin is. He wrote The Purple Cow, I think 10 other, maybe more, international best-selling books. He's a marketing guy, passive marketing. And the reasoning is that I really want to interview him is I built a list when I first started of 100 influencers I wanted to interview. And since that point, I've interviewed everyone that was still alive. So there was a few that passed away that I couldn't interview. Every single one, and Seth is the only one left. So out of 100, he's the last one. And so he's the one because of the fact that I think it'll be an epic interview, but at the same time, because it's the holdout. You know, it's like if somebody says that you can't have this cookie, you want that cookie more than anything in the world. So it's the same thing. I've been told I can't have this interview, so of course I want to try to do everything I can to make it happen. And, you know, as long as we're both still here on Earth, I'm going to keep every, year, 6 months, I'll reach out and see if the time has changed and see if the timing is right. So Seth Godin will be the answer.
Well, that is all the time we have for you today on The Ready Writer. I want to thank our guest, Corey Poirier, for stopping on by and sharing his journey with us. And of course, thank you so much, audience, for taking the time to watch. Thank you and have a great day.